Political institutions. Russian history includes a variety of regime types, but tradition is highly authoritarian. The reforms that began in the early 1990s are truly experimental, and only time will tell whether democracy and a free market economy will take root. Even if they do, the nature of the regime must take into account Russian political culture and traditions. Current political parties, elections, and institutions of government are all new, and their functions within the political system are very fluid and likely to change within the next few years. However, the Russian Federation survived its first few rocky years, and many experts believe that at least some aspects of Russian government and politics are settling into a pattern. Even though the Soviet Union was highly centralized, it still maintained a federal government structure. The Russian Federation has retained this model, and the current regime consists of 89 regions, 21 of which are ethnically non-Russian by majority. Each region is bound by treaty to the Federation, but not all, including Chechnya, have signed on. Most of these regions are called republics, and because the central government was not strong under Yeltsin, many ruled themselves almost independently. In the early 1990s, several republics went so far as to make claims of sovereignty that amounted to near or complete independence. Many saw the successful bid of the former Soviet states for independence as role models, and they believed that their own status would change as well. Chechnya's bid for independence and the war that followed are good examples of this sentiment. Some regions are much stronger than others, so power is devolved unequally across the country, a condition called asymmetric federalism. As president, Vladimir Putin has cracked down on regional autonomy, ordering the army to shell even Chechnya into submission. Several measures that Putin imposed were creation of super districts. In 2000, 7 new federal districts were created to encompass all of Russia. Each district is headed by a presidential appointee who supervises the local authorities as Putin sees fit. Removal of governors. A law allows the president to remove from office a governor who refuses to subject local law to national constitution. Appointment of governors. Putin further centralized power in Moscow in late 2004, when a measure that ended direct elections of the 89 regional governors. Instead, the governors are now nominated by the president and then confirmed by regional legislatures. Changes in the Federation Council. Originally, the Federation Council, the upper legislative house, was comprised of governors and Duma heads of each region. In 2002, a Putin-backed change prohibited these officials from serving themselves, although they are still allowed to appoint council members. Elimination of single-member district seats in the Duma. Many minor political parties were able to capture Duma seats under the old rules that allowed half of the 450 seats to be elected by single-member districts, and half by proportional representation. In 2005, Putin initiated a change to a pure proportional representation electoral system that eliminated candidates that were regionally popular. The new rules first applied to the election of 2007. As a result of all these changes, the Federation is highly centralized. Linkage institutions. Groups that link citizens to government are still not strong in Russia, a situation that undermines recent attempts to establish a democracy. Political parties were highly unstable and fluid during the 1990s, and since Putin's election in 2000, more power has concentrated in his party, so that after the parliamentary elections of late 2003 and the presidential elections of early 2004, no strong opposing political parties were in existence. In the Duma elections of 2011, United Russia lost seats while opposition parties gained seats, but United Russia still managed to retain 238 of the 450 Duma seats. In the 2012 presidential race, Putin gained almost 64% of the vote, with his nearest opponent gathering only 17%. Interest groups have no solid footing in civil society since private organizations are weak, and the media has come under more government control. Parties. Most established democracies had many years to develop party and electoral systems. However, Russians put theirs together almost overnight after the revolution of 1991. Many small, factional parties ran candidates in the first Duma elections in 1993, and by 1995, 43 parties were on the ballot. Many of the parties revolved around a particular leader or leaders, such as the Bloc of General Andrei Nikolaev and academician Sviatoslav Fyodorov, and the Yuri Boldarov movement, or Yabloko, which is an acronym for its three founders. Others reflected a particular group, such as the Party of Pensioners, Agrarian Party of Russia, or Women of Russia. By 1999, the number of parties who ran Duma candidates had shrunk to 26, but many of the parties were new ones, including Vladimir Putin's United Party. Needless to say, with these fluctuations, citizens have had no time to develop party loyalties. Leadership in Russia continues to be personalistic, and political parties remain weak and fluid. New election rules initiated by Vladimir Putin in 2005 solidified this trend toward fewer political parties. Before 2007, half of the Duma's 450 seats were elected by proportional representation and half by single-member districts. The rules changed so that all seats, starting in the 2007 election, are elected by proportional representation, with all parties required to win a minimum of 7% of the national vote in order to win any seats. Smaller parties with regional support lost representation, and only 4 parties gained seats in the election of 2007 and 2011: United Russia, the Communist Party, the Liberal Democrats, and A Just Russia. United Russia. The party was founded in April 2001 as a merger of Fatherland All Russia Party and the United Party of Russia. The Unity Party was put together by oligarch Boris Berezovsky and other entrepreneurs to support then Prime Minister Vladimir Putin in the presidential election of 2000. The merger put even more political support behind Putin. United Russia won 221 of the 450 Duma seats in the election of 2003. Although this figure underestimated the party's strength since many minor parties were Putin supporters or clients. Putin, running as United Russia's candidate, won the presidential election of 2004 with 71% of the vote, with no serious challengers from any political parties. In the fall of 2007, Putin announced his willingness to head the party list at the General Duma election in 2007. Since Duma election rules had been changed at his initiative in 2005 to pure proportional representation, this move ensured that he would be elected to the Duma, and so eligible to become prime minister. United Russia gained more than 64% of the vote in the election of 2007, which translated to 315 of the 450 seats in the Duma. Putin's hand-picked successor, Dmitry Medvedev, won the presidential election of 2008 with about 70% of the vote, and chose Putin as his prime minister. Putin's decision to run for president in 2012 was controversial, enough that United Russia lost seats, 315 in 2007, compared to 238 in 2011. And Putin won the presidential election with 64% of the vote, as compared to Medvedev's 70% in 2008. Ideologically, United Russia is hard to define except that it is pro-Putin. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation, CPRF. The Communist Party of the old Soviet Union survives today as the second strongest party in the Duma, even though it has not yet won a presidential election. After the election of 1995, it held 157 of the Duma's 450 members, and even though the party lost seats in the 1999 election, it remained an important force in Russian politics. However, the party's support dropped significantly in the parliamentary elections of 2003 and 2007, winning only 51 of the 450 Duma seats in 2003 and 57 in 2007. However, the party won 92 seats in 2011, benefiting from the discontent with Putin and United Russia. The party's leader, Gennady Zyuganov, came in second in 1996 and 2000 presidential elections, but its percentage in the second round fell from 40.3% in 1996 to 29.21% in 2000. Zyuganov dropped out of the presidential election in 2004, and in July 2004, a breakaway faction led by Vladimir Tikhonov weakened the party further. In 2008, the party's candidate was again Zyuganov, who gained less than 18% of the vote, second to Medvedev's more than 70% of the vote. Zyuganov's share in 2012 was more than 17% compared to Putin's almost 64%. The CPRF is not like the old Communist Party, but it is far less reformist than other parties are. Zyuganov opposed many reforms during the Gorbachev era, and he continues to represent to support the stability of the old regime. The party emphasizes central planning and nationalism, and implies an intention to regain territories lost when the Soviet Union broke apart. Liberal Democrats. This misnamed party is by far the most controversial. It is headed by Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who has made headlines around the world for his extreme nationalist positions. He regularly attacks reformist leaders and particularly dislikes Yeltsin. He has implied that Russia under his leadership would use nuclear weapons on Japan, and he makes frequent anti-Semitic remarks, despite his Jewish origins. He has also brought the wrath of Russian women by making blatantly sexist comments. His party was reformulated as Zhirinovsky's Bloc for the 2000 presidential election, when he received only 2.7% of the vote. The party did pick up seats in 2003 Duma elections, receiving about 11% of the total vote, as well as 37 seats. The rule changes for the 2007 elections did not impact the party's representation significantly, although they won 40 seats, a gain of 3 over the 2003 election. In 2012, the party benefited from Putin's controversial power play, winning 56 seats. A Just Russia. A Just Russia was formed in 2006 by the merger of Motherland People's Patriotic Union with the Party of Pensioners and the Party of Life. The party is led by the Speaker of the Federation Council, Sergei Mironov. Motherland formed in 2003 with a merger of 30 organizations, but its leaders quarreled over whether or not to challenge Putin in the 2004 presidential race, and the party split in two, with one faction forming Fair Russia. The party passed a 7% threshold in the Duma election of 2007, with 7.74% of the vote, enough to gain them 38 seats. A Just Russia did much better in 2011, winning 64 Duma seats. Patriots of Russia. During the regional elections of 2011, a party few had heard of, Patriots of Russia, managed to win 8% of the vote, a surprising turn even though United Russia won 70% of all seats. The Communist Party came in second with 13% of the seats, but the Patriots of Russia came in third. Analysts say the party was a Kremlin product, tested with a view to being deployed in the parliamentary elections in December 2011. It described itself as a party of statists and patriots that aims to build a great and prosperous Russia. Critics, however, say that its real purpose is to foil the Communist Party and a Just Russia, and that it is an integral part of the political system set up by the Kremlin. In the legislative elections of December 2011, less than 1% of the electorate chose the Patriots of Russia, so the party did not win any Duma seats. Overall, since 1993, ideological parties have faded in importance and have been replaced by parties of power, or parties strongly sponsored by economic and political power holders. For example, United Russia is Putin's party, created by powerful oligarchs to get him elected. As long as Putin is in power, United Russia will be, too, especially since he was able to orchestrate who his successor would be in 2008. At the time of the election, Putin was tremendously popular, as was reflected in United Russia's landslide in the Duma elections of 2007. The two elections confirm that the party of power remains the voters' choice. Even though Putin and United Russia lost some support in the election of 2011 and 2012, they remain firmly in control of the government with 238 of the 450 seats in the Duma. Elections. The Russian political system supports 3 types of national votes. Referendum. The Constitution of 1993 allows the president to call for national referenda by popular vote on important issues. Even before the Constitution was written, Boris Yeltsin called for a referendum on his job performance. The people clearly supported his reforms, but his majorities were not overwhelming. The second referendum was held later in the year, and the people voted in favor of the new constitution. A regional referendum was held in Chechnya in 2003 to approve a constitution for the area. The constitution was approved, including the phrase that declared Chechnya to be an inseparable part of Russia. Duma elections. Russian citizens have gone to the polls 6 times to elect Duma representatives. 1993, 1995, 1999, 2003, 2007, and 2011, and actually 2016. The Duma had 450 seats, and until 2007, half were elected by proportional representation, and the other half by single-member districts. As of 2007, the 225 single-member districts were abolished, so that all Duma seats now are assigned exclusively by proportional representation. Also eliminated was the against all option that allowed voters to reject all candidates. Parties must get at least 7%, raised from 5% before 2007, of the total vote to get any seats according to the proportional representation. The election changes were initiated by Putin, who argued that the new rules would reduce the number of parties in the Duma and thus make policymaking more efficient. Since 1993, parties have merged and disappeared, so that only a few have survived to the present. Presidential elections. Presidential elections follow the two-round model that requires the winning candidate to receive more than 50% of the vote. In 2000, Putin received 52.94% of the vote, so no runoff election was required. Since he captured a majority in the first round, Communist Gennady Zyuganov received 29.21%, and no other candidate garnered more than 5.8%. Some observers have questioned the honesty of elections, particularly since the media obviously promoted Yeltsin in 1996 and Putin in 2000. A 2001 law seriously restricted the rights of small, regional parties to run presidential candidates. So critics questioned how democratic future presidential elections might be. The presidential election of 2004 added credence to the criticism, since Vladimir Putin won with 71% of the vote, again requiring no runoff. His closest competitor was Nikolai Karatanov, who ran for the Communist Party and received less than 14% of the vote. In 2008, Putin was ineligible to run, but his chosen successor, Dmitry Medvedev, won the election with more than 70% of the vote. In 2012, Putin's share of the vote slipped to 64%, but he still managed to avoid a runoff election. Interest groups. Of course, interest groups were only allowed in the Soviet Union under state corporatism and were controlled by the government. Decision-making took place within the Central Committee and the Politburo, and if any outside contacts influenced policy, they generally were confined to members of the Communist Party. When market capitalism suddenly replaced centralized economic control in 1991, the state-owned industries were up for grabs, and those that bought them for almost nothing were generally insiders, members of the nomenklatura, who have since become quite wealthy. This collection of oligarchs may be defined loosely as an interest group, because they have been a major influence in the policymaking process during the formative years of the Russian Federation. The oligarchy. The power of the oligarchy became obvious during the last year of Boris Yeltsin's first term as president of the Russian Federation. The tycoons were tied closely to members of Yeltsin's family, particularly his daughter. Together they took advantage of Yeltsin's inattention to his presidential duties, and soon monopolized Russian industries and built huge fortunes. One of the best-known oligarchs was Boris Berezovsky, who admitted in 1997 that he and 6 other entrepreneurs controlled over half of the Russian GNP. Berezovsky's business had giant holdings in the oil industry and in media, including a TV network and many newspapers. He used the media to ensure Yeltsin's re-election in 1996, and he and the family clearly controlled the presidency. When Yeltsin's ill health and alcoholism triggered events that led to his resignation in 2000, Berezovsky went to work with other oligarchs to put together and finance the Unity Party. When Unity's presidential candidate, Vladimir Putin, easily won the election with more than 50% of the vote in the first round, it looked as if the oligarchs had survived Yeltsin's demise. Putin, however, has shown some resistance to oligarchic control. He has clashed with the entrepreneurs on several occasions, and when television magnate Vladimir Guzinsky harshly criticized Putin's reform plans, Guzinsky was arrested for corruption and his company was given to state-owned monopoly. Both Berezovsky and Guzinsky are now in exile, but they still have close political and economic connections in Russia. In October 2003, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the richest man in Russia and the chief executive officer of Yukos Oil Company, was arrested as a signal from Putin that the Russian government was consolidating power. The government slapped massive penalties and additional taxes on Yukos, forcing it into bankruptcy. In 2011, Khodorkovsky was sentenced to jail, this time for stealing oil, while during his first trial he was convicted for avoiding taxes on the sale of oil. In late 2013, Putin pardoned him and he left the country. The other oligarchs heeded the warning from Khodorkovsky's example and largely withdrew from political activities, leaving Putin in control but probably with a narrower base of support from economic leaders. However, as the Russian economy sank during the recession that began in late 2007, oligarchs have found themselves heavily in debt and have looked to the state for loans. Even though the government has been cash-strapped as well, the economic climate has the potential for weakening the power of the oligarchs and giving the government more control over them. Putin's choice for the president, Dmitry Medvedev, was chairman of Gazprom until he was elected president of the Russian Federation in May 2008, and he was replaced at Gazprom by Viktor Zubkov, the prime minister, who was in turn replaced by Vladimir Putin. State corporatism. Under Putin's leadership, state corporatism, where the state determines which groups have input into policymaking, has become well established. The Russian government has established vast state-owned holding companies in automobile and aircraft manufacturing, shipbuilding, nuclear power, diamonds, titanium, and other industries. If companies appear to be too independent or too rich, the government has not forced owners to sell, but has cited legal infractions, such as with Yukos, to force sales. Either government-controlled companies or companies run by men seen as loyal to Mr. Putin are the beneficiaries. Another term for such an arrangement is insider privatization. The Russian Mafia. A larger and even more shadowy influence in the oligarchs is known as the Mafia, but this interest group controls much more than underworld crime. Like the oligarchs, they gained power during the chaotic time of the revolution of 1991, and they control local businesses, natural resources, and banks. They thrive on payoffs from businesses, protection money, money laundering, and deals that they make with the Russian government officials, including members of the former KGB. They have murdered bankers, journalists, businessmen, and members of the Duma. The huge fortunes made by the oligarchs and mafia offend the sensibilities of most Russian citizens, who tend to value equality of result, not equality of opportunity. In Russia's past, the lawlessness has been dealt with by repressive authoritarian rule, and these groups represent a major threat to the survival of new democracy. The Russian media. For years, the official newspaper of the Soviet Union's Communist Party, Pravda, was only printed what government officials wanted it to, and so it became an important propaganda tool for the Communist Party. After the coup of 1991 and the dissolution of the country, Pravda continued as an independent newspaper with more freedom of the press than the country had ever allowed. Under Putin, the government again tightened its hold on the press, but Pravda has reinvented itself as a tabloid with a huge audience. Today, it has little to fear from official censorship because its investigative journalism tends toward exposés of incompetent police work, corrupt low-level officials, and dirty train stations. Its biggest stories focus on celebrities such as fashion models, radio hosts, and a hockey player hit with a cake. For serious journalists, however, who want to investigate the top layers of political power, it's a different story. During a joint press conference with Vladimir Putin in early 2005, 2 Russian reporters challenged comments by U.S. President George Bush about the lack of a free press in Russia. Of course, the reporters were handpicked to accompany Putin on his trip to the United States, but they argued that the Russian media often criticizes the government. It is true that newspapers and television stations are now privately owned in Russia, although the state controls many of them. There are also many instances of reporters commenting on political actions and decisions, but how much real freedom they have is not clear. One example occurred when the Kremlin used a state-controlled TV company to take over the only independent television network, NTV. When they ousted MTV and journalists took over a different channel, TV6, the state shut it down. Russian media circles also were suspicious of the alleged poisoning of Anna Politkovskaya, one of the most outspoken critics of the government's policies in Chechnya. In March 2007, correspondent Ivan Safonov, who worked for the business daily Kommersant, died in a fall from a window of his Moscow apartment. The status of freedom of the press in Russia is illustrated by media coverage of the school seizure at Beslan in 2004. As the tragedy unfolded on Friday, 2 of Russia's main TV channels did not mention what was happening until an hour after the explosions were first heard at the school. The state-owned Russia TV and Channel 1 finally reported it. They returned to their regularly scheduled programs. However, NTV, which is owned by state-controlled Gazprom, did have rolling coverage for 3 hours, even though it started late. State corporatism appears to impact the media business just as it has oil, gas, aircraft building, and auto companies. For example, in May 2007, the Russian Union of Journalists was evicted from its headquarters in Moscow to make space for the Russia Today television channel. According to the General Secretary of the RUJ, the eviction was based on an order from President Vladimir Putin to accommodate the expansion plans of the state-owned English-language channel, which aims to promote a positive image of Russia abroad. One newspaper, the Novaya Gazeta, has blatantly criticized the Russian government. Since 2000, 5 employees of Novaya Gazeta have died under violent or suspicious circumstances. The latest were in January 2009, when the newspaper's lawyer, Stanislav Markelov, and a young reporter, Anastasia Babarova, were fatally shot by a masked gunman. The editor, Dmitry Muratov, put 2 of his reporters under armed protection and instituted a policy that any article with sensitive information was to be published immediately, reducing the benefit of killing the reporters. No one blames the government directly for the attacks, but the message is clear: don't criticize the government. The social media played an important role in the protests that surrounded the legislative election of 2011. One of the leaders, Alexei Navalny, trained as a real estate lawyer, became famous before the election with his online exposés of corruption within state-owned companies. His following on Twitter and LiveJournal grew into the tens of thousands, and he summoned reporters to gather in protest of the Putin-dominated Duma elections. In 2013, Navalny went on trial for embezzling $500,000 from a timber company that led to a 5-year prison sentence. Putin's critics claim that Navalny was being punished because of his criticisms and because he announced his candidacy for mayor of Moscow